Hi everybody, welcome to this painting tutorial. Today we're going to be tackling a Space Wolf Sergeant for the Horus Heresy. Now as you can see, he's here in Mark III armour, but I've made a few tweaks. There's the old school banner pole, which I'm a massive fan of, and I've green stuffed on some fur as a tabard. I can't wait to get cracking, so let's dig in. Onto our base coat. Now you'll notice we've primed the miniature, and in this case we've done it with Vallejo polyurethane black. There's no reason why you can't use a rattle can for this. In fact, any primer will do, but for me the darker the better. To get our iconic stormy grey tones that are so indicative of the 6th Legion, I'm using Graphene Grey by Scale 75. And in this instance, I'm running it through my Harder & Steenbeck CR Plus, the 2-in-1, and I'm using the 0.4mm nozzle set. We're currently rocking this through at about 25 psi, and we've diluted this graphene grey about 4 parts thinner to 1 part paint. It seems to work for me running it through the airbrush. I know that Scale 75 isn't the easiest to work with in terms of getting it through an airbrush, but it seems to work for me. Now the reason potentially that I find it a little easier is I pre-mix all of my Scale 75 paint in a separate dish before adding it to the airbrush. For me it's good practice, and helps me to sort of really pay attention to how dilute my paints are. On top of that, I absolutely love Scale 75. The matte, and in some cases super matte finish that it generates are exactly what I'm looking for, particularly in my Heresy miniatures. Now, you'll notice we are applying multiple really thin layers to generate this base coat. That's absolutely fine, and whilst this is technically almost a speed paint in terms of scheme, I find that it doesn't take up too much time whatsoever, and you can knock out entire squads using this method quite easily. It's all about generating a nice, solid, good coverage base coat across the miniature, and take as much time and as many layers as you feel you need to do this. Because of the dilution of the paint, you don't need to worry about flooding detail. And take the fur, for example, here. There appears to be a lot of paint on it. There isn't really, and it should be good to go. With the base coat set, let's get on to the highlights. On to the highlights. As you can see, the base coat is now dried and is a solid matte finish in that dark stormy grey that we like. For our highlight tones, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Scale 75's Graphene Grey, our base coat, and Graphite by Scale 75. Now this combination, albeit 50-50, is diluted roughly the same as our base coat, and again we'll apply it through an airbrush. Now what I'm looking to do here is to generate an imaginary light source to guide where we're putting these highlights. It's very similar to the way the wonderful folks at Cult of Paint do things. Now for this miniature, we're looking at above and from the right if you're looking at the front, and above and from the right if you're looking at the rear of the miniature. Now the reason we've diluted our paint the same way as we did with our base coat is so that we can really control where we put these highlights. As you can see, the difference in colour is very subtle, and that's intentional. My Heresy miniatures are weathered extremely, and I don't like clean Heresy, so you will not really see too much of these highlights in the finished article, but for me they add a certain level of something that can't really be replicated any other way. Again, we're going to use as many thinned coats as we need to generate this highlight, focusing on those areas that our imaginary light sources would hit, talking the front and outside of the left leg, the left shoulder pad from front to back, and then the opposite on the right hand side, so the rear of the right leg, the rear of the right shoulder pad, and so on and so on. We also get quite a lot across the top of the backpack. Now the reason for this is the face, top of the backpack from behind, are focal points for the eyes, or at least we want them to be. And as such, we kind of pay a bit more attention to those areas. It seems to work for me, and I really like the effect it generates. Now, as you can see, by the time we've applied one coat to the back, the front is ready for another one. That's the level of dilution that I was going for. And it helps to speed this process along a little bit so that we can get our miniatures out on the table and into battle as soon as we can. And with our armour now completed, we move on to our metallics. First of all, we're going to black out all of these areas, in this case with Vallejo Model Air Black. It's already diluted more than enough, so we don't need to do anything. And this will be applied with a size 0 brush. It forms a perfect base coat for what we're going to do in terms of our metallics. For all of our gold trim, we are going to be applying a base coat of Decayed Metal by Scale 75. Now, apologies for getting the top of my head in this shot. I'm still not entirely used to recording myself while painting. But as for the base coat, Decayed Metal has rapidly become my go-to for all gold, brass, bronze, and anything of that nature. It's an absolute joy to work with. In this case, we have diluted it slightly with some water, and I'm applying it with a size 0 brush. And we're just going to cover all of the areas of trim around the model that we're going to be finishing up with gold. This includes the top of the banner pole and all the adornments around it, as well as all of the trim that we blacked out in the previous step. With our base coat laid down, we're now at this stage in proceedings, where all of the gold trim, including the fine details around the edges of our plates and the adornments on top of the banner pole, are now base coated in that decayed metal. As you can see from the way it dries, it's going to be an ideal for any sort of warm metallic colours, and I'm really happy with it. Now we move on to our other metallics, our silvers. For our silver pieces, we are going to switch away from Scale 75 to another one of my favourites, and this is Vallejo Metal Colour. In this case, we're using burnt iron. It creates a dark metallic silver colour. We're going to make sure that we get all of these adornments, all of the silver pieces, including the grenades, the areas of trim on the backpack, with this colour. Now, you don't need to dilute this whatsoever. It comes straight out of the pot in what I can only describe as the best coverage that I've ever seen from a metallic. We make sure that we just effectively draw it into the detail and let the paint do the work. Again, we're applying this with a brush, but we've now gone down to a size 3 0, in this case by Raphael. And that's because some of the details can be a little bit more tricky to get to. The edge of the vent, for example. With that completed, it's now time to tackle some of the other details on the miniature. We're going to start here with the furs. Now, the furs are going to receive a heavily diluted coat of Thondia Brown. by Games Workshop. Now, the reason it's so heavily diluted is because the level of detail in this fur, given that it was done by green stuff rather than being a part of the miniature itself, it creates some really deep recesses, and we need the paint to flow into them. And we need the paint to flow into them because of the now light grey that sits underneath it. Now, this may take a couple of coats, but I've found that Thondia Brown has some excellent coverage, even when diluted this heavily. And just make sure we run it into all those details and make sure we cover everything over properly. We're also going to hit the furs on the top of the banner pole, and we're going to highlight those up later in exactly the same method as this fur tabard. Again, don't worry about the paint being this diluted. If you do feel you need to use a second coat, by all means do so. It's not going to hurt you, and it might end up being just a little bit extra time in terms of finishing this step up. We move on now to highlighting all of these furs, and for this we are going to use Xandri Dust by Citadel. We're also going to use it as the base coat for the banner on top of that backpack. Now, we've diluted this quite heavily with water. That's because we want it to flow and almost in places become translucent. That's intentional for the furs as it's a highlight step, but for the banner is going to require more than one coat. For these furs, we are going to cover approximately 50% of the surface area, but we're going to create a bit of a jagged edge with it and just feather the brush over those details. The same applies for the furs on top of the banner pole. But as I said, when it comes to the banner itself, we're going to need 2 of these coats. And we're going to paint everything except the big wolf icon in the middle of that banner. That's going to remain black, and as such, we're going to create a lot of contrast. Now we move on to the shading stage of both of these, and this will be using Seraphim Sepia, again by Games Workshop, and we're going to just daub this all over the banner and the furs. This is going to create another layer of shading and a slightly warmer tone in the finished miniature. With that done, we move on to the highlighting stage for our banner. Now this is done with Screaming Skull by Games Workshop, and it's quite a jump in terms of the lightness of these highlights. This is intentional because of what we do later on, but with this we are picking out the most raised areas of detail and really digging in with some quite fat highlights. With our subsequent steps, we then bring this back down, and you'll see that as we move through it. But for now, it's quite a fine highlight on the edges, but we're making sure we capture all of those raised details. What we're going to do now is prep the miniature for our next couple of steps, and we're going to do that by hitting it with a coat of gloss varnish, and I'm using the gloss Lucky varnish from Ammo by Meg to achieve this through the airbrush. Now I've found that it's really important to do this in multiple thin layers. That way we don't gum up any of our detail with unnecessary volumes of varnish. It's really simple to achieve this, and I've not done a tutorial on the face as that will be coming in a later video. It's far too much to be putting into this one. It could turn it into an extra hour's worth of footage, which feels unnecessary at this stage. But apply this in 2 or 3 thin coats until you get everywhere covered nicely. We now move on to one of my favourite steps, and that's the oil wash. It's the reason we put down that coat of gloss varnish, and it's to protect the miniature as well as to provide a slippery surface. Now for this, I'm using 2 paints by Abtalung 502. And the first of which is this brown tone, it's called Bitume. and it's a dark, warm brown. The second is Starship Filth, which is a dark, grey, dirty tone. And there's roughly 50-50. It's roughly 1-to-1 in terms of the ratio of colour. Now, because these are oil paints, you need to thin these down with something other than water or airbrush thinner. And in this case, we're using good old-fashioned white spirit. You can pick this up from hardware stores or anywhere that's vaguely decorated in nature. And it acts as a solvent for these. Now, I use a very, very old brush for this, and all we're doing is mixing those oil paints in with the solvent until we get the finish we want. And we're doing this in one of the silver dishes, or stainless steel dishes that I mentioned before when I was talking about my airbrush mixes. It's one of those, and they're really, really cheap. We're going to mix this up into a heavy wash consistency. And the reason for that is this is going to be applied all over the miniature, with the exception of the face. And it's going to create one of my favourite finishes in this hobby, in miniature painting. Using the brush we mixed it with, so that we don't knacker up any of our decent brushes, we are going to cover all of the armour plates with this. And we're going to wait for about 20 minutes to half an hour for a bit of drying to take place, for some of that solvent to evaporate. Cover all of these plates with this colour to achieve the effect we're after. Once that step is complete, you should have something that looks a little bit like this. Excuse the fumbling of the miniature. It looks almost ruined, but we're going to pull back some of that oil wash where we want it. We're going to do that with a cotton wool bud or a Q-tip, and using some of the white spirit that we used to dilute our oil paints. We're simply going to dip the Q-tip into the solvent and then begin to rub off some of the oil wash from where we want it. I find this is a much simpler way of doing things than trying to precisely control where we put our oil wash, and I find it much simpler to achieve the effect we're after. One thing to be mindful of is the direction in which you draw this oil wash off the miniature. I tend to think it looks better when you draw down in vertical strokes, or in strokes that are perpendicular to the armour plate, in this case, that you pull it off from. This may take a number of Q-tips and a number of passes to achieve the effect you're after, depending on how dirty or how weathered you want your miniature to be, but ultimately it all follows the same pattern. Draw down where possible, and eventually you will achieve the effect you're looking for. For me, I like my heresy to be the opposite of clean. I think is the best way of phrasing it. I've got no time for clean heresy, particularly when it's for a legion such as the 6th, the Space Wolves. I think this level of grittiness is appropriate for the miniature and appropriate for the setting. And by the time we're done, we'll end up with something that does look battle worn and really epitomises the savagery of the legion we're painting. Don't forget the banner, as that's quite important too. These things are old in my mind's eye. They are designed to look ancient and have been around for absolutely ages on the battlefield. As you can see, we didn't touch the face with the oil wash, so there's no need to go over that with this. But eventually you'll get to a point that you're happy with. And that is where, we call it a day for this and move on to our next step. With our oil wash removed, we move on to our next step, and that is to apply a coat of matte varnish. In this case, it's again Ammo by MIG's Lucky Ultra Matte Varnish, and as you can see, I've also applied decals to the miniature. Much like with the gloss varnish, we are going to do this in 3 or 4 thin coats using the airbrush, and that's just to take the shine back out of things, as well as to protect our decals. Excuse me, fumbling this miniature all over the place. With the matte varnish applied, as you can see, it's taken all of the shine out and brought some of that stormy grey colour back. And we're moving on to highlighting our gold trim. Now for this, we're moving back to scale 75, and we're going to use Necro Gold. It's a slightly green tone gold, and I'm a massive fan of it. Now to apply this, we're not going to highlight all of the gold trim. We're going to use a technique whereby we dab the highlight colour onto the raised areas and then into some of the flatter parts while edge highlighting certain other areas. Now by dabbing the paint onto the miniature like this, we don't get 100% coverage, and by doing so we get the sort of finish that we're after in our finished model. This finish kind of allows some of that base coat and the depth of that shade to remain in our finished product. Now onto another one of my favourites, which is chipping, and to do this we're going to use a foam sponge brush type of thing. I picked it up from a hardware store and it's been a lifesaver. What we're going to do is take some GW Rhinox hide and we're going to apply it straight from the pot, dabbed onto this applicator, as it were, brush off the excess and then press it against the miniature. By doing this, we generate battle damage, and once stippled all over the miniature, it does create quite an effect. Finally, and the last step in this miniature, will be to create the green glowing plasma coils. Now, as you can see, I've already base coated these through the airbrush and allowed a little bit of overspill onto the rest of the gun casing using Vallejo Model Air White. To generate the green glow, we're going to use Vallejo Fluorescent Green through the airbrush. Now I've thinned this roughly 1:1 with airbrush thinner, and I've knocked the PSI down to about 15 PSI, and I'm being really careful and methodical while applying this. The idea being is that we cover over all of that white base coat, and it generates a green glow all across both the plasma coils, as you can see, and some of that gun casing, and it helps to create almost an OSL effect, object source lighting. It's not OSL because we're not, in my opinion anyway, because we're not transferring it to any other part of the miniature. And with that, our Space Wolf Sergeant is now complete and ready to join his packmates on the field of battle. Hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for your time. See you soon.